Oh, look, speaking of the devil, just kidding. This is a Christian conversation. Speaking of the angel. Love it. Okay. Hey, Tyler.
Hey there.
Oh, my goodness. Hi, Tyler. How are you?
I am good. The angel in your presence.
Did you hear that?
I did.
I was like,
No,
okay,
happy to be here.
I know. I'm so happy for you to be here. Thank you, Tyler. So I just want to kick us off. Like we're jumping in. We're coming in hot. Meg knows you, so looks like we're having a conversation. If you don't know me, I'm Rose Francois. I am founder of A Rising Up, and I'm also a writer and someone who's passionate about racism. Wanted to have this conversation for a lot of things, and I'll share a little bit, but I wanted to bring on Tyler because I was scrolling through, my Instagram, scrolling through my Facebook, watching the news, and I honestly did not see people like Tyler who is speaking community, who is speaking, really vulnerability and talking about the Christian community in the way that he was. And so I decided to reach out to him, and he was like, yes, let's do it. And I was like, really? So here we are. And Tyler, I definitely want you to introduce yourself because from the short time that I've already talked to you this week, it feels like, I've known you a little bit longer. And I think it's because it's kind of the presence that you bring. So please introduce yourself, and then we'll kind of go on with the conversation.
Wow. Shucks, I'm so honored by the introduction. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Tyler Stewart. I am a graphic designer and I also work for a Christian ministry that works with college students and I just really started getting passionate about anti-racism within the last few years. And I think it was really coming from not knowing anything about it to suddenly just really diving in and learning a lot that has caused me to be really passionate. And now I've been exploring what it looks like to use my design abilities to actually do something good. So that's kind of what I'm exploring. And yeah, Rose and I had been able to connect and talk a little bit about it. But like you said, there's not a lot of white Christians who are really out there talking about racism and being vulnerable while they do it. So there's a I have to work a lot in myself to not be too proud or feel like I've arrived because I make a lot of mistakes all the time. So I try to be pretty upfront about those.
And I love that about you, right? I think being upfront and being direct is what we need right now because we need
Mhm.
truth and we need honesty to move forward. So before we begin,
Absolutely.
kind of jump into what we believe here, we're going to just start with a moment of silence. Y'all, I have my y'all phrase because I'm a girl who grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. And listen, the Southern twang comes through. So I want to say y'all, we are going to have a moment of silence for the collective grief that's been happening. We have over 1 million people who've been affected by coronavirus in the United States alone. That's insane. We have people who've lost their loved ones, people who are out in the community who are protesting who's lost loved ones, people who, are praying, and people who are sick. There's just so much going on. And so it would be, a dishonor if we did not do that. And so let's have a quick moment of silence, about 30 seconds, just to pause and just reflect on the collective grief and to send out positive energy. Okay. I think it takes this isn't even a good way to say it, but great bravery to be quiet on a live. So I appreciate you, Tyler, for joining me at that. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to begin with the conversation that we're having today is about racism and what Christians should do. So number one, we believe in community. We do not believe in chaos. There's a book that I mentioned in my recent live talking about the book by Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote a book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, literally months before his death. And I truly believe in that. I truly believe in bringing spirituality really with the movement and practicality. And that's where we come in as Christians. And so we believe in movement, community, and unity and solidarity in the Christian community. I'll say that again.
Yes.
I feel like nobody heard that. We believe in solidarity in the Christian community. We need it as a kingdom. We are one. And I want to start off with that conversation. Amen.
Yes. Yes. Amen.
Have that conversation. And I'm happy to have this conversation with Tyler. So I'll start there. And Tyler introduced himself early on before we got into it. So let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing I kind of want to bring up, Tyler, please, feel free to go back and forth because, I'm a talker from what we've experienced. Let's go ahead and be direct about what the observations are, right? So I'll begin and kind of go in a little bit deeper as to why I wanted to have this live. And then I would love for you to jump in on your observation. So I'm looking on Instagram, I'm watching the news, just like many of you, and I'm seeing a lot of division, right? Not just in the world, but not just in, what's happening in different communities. Obviously, Black Lives Matter. I am seeing a lot of division in the Christian community. And that really struck me. And I felt it. I felt grief in my spirit. Like I was going to sleep, like, man, there's something I got to do here, right? And I really felt it in my spirit to say, what do I do? And I really was led to read, started to read again, the book, Where We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. And I was like, okay, this is where we go. We go to community. And that's what I've been feeling. I've been feeling the grief of the lack of community in our Christian kingdom community. And that's so hard, but it's real. And this is for Black folks. This is for white folks. This is for people of color. Like as Christians, as believers, we have a duty to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God, right? Micah 6:8. And we got to look around and say, wait a minute, if the world's not right, we got to be right as brothers and sisters. So that's why I started this conversation really in my head and like talking to God. And then I was like, I need to talk to someone. And then I kind of found Tyler. So Tyler, like, tell me about observations you've had, if any, right, about similarities of my experience.
Yeah, lack of unity right now is real. And it's especially disheartening when we see it so much in Christian circles and even, just within Christianity between racial lines, there's just so much division. And oftentimes when unity gets brought up, that gets translated as uniformity. And that's not it. Unity and uniformity are totally different. So unity says we can think differently and look differently and do things a different way, but we can be united because we're all in Christ. And uniformity says, if you don't think like me, get out or go away or you're different. And that is just not what we're called to as Christians. We're called to unity. But I think especially right now, I mean, really for all of history, white Christians have been pretty implicit in racism, especially, and not even implicit almost implies passivity, which for a lot of people, I think passivity is true. But I think especially what we're seeing right now is not just that people don't care or they aren't speaking up, but there's actually a lot of white people who are resisting conversations around racism, immediately condemning the conversations about racism as divisive rather than condemning racism as divisive. And so we just see a lot of chaos right now, even just amongst ourselves as we try to talk about issues and that's denied or, people are feeling really angry and emotional. Not even willing to engage the topic.
Right. Preach. Listen, I can hear you talk all day. And I feel it, I feel that white Christians are looking at racism as, not racism, as the movement, as divisive, right? I love that you separated unity and uniformity because like, yo, we're different and that's okay. That's actually great. It makes us more valuable when we come.
Absolutely.
Right. I don't want you talking about things that I already know. I want to hear more things. Right. And so I love that idea that you brought that together. I also love the directness about it. And at the same time, right, not just white Christians, right, because I don't want to make it like a white and black thing.
Totally.
We have people in the Black community, people in the, people of color community. That sounds interesting to say, but it's true. Who are also being divisive. Let's be real here, So I think as we narrow it down and we talk about our observations of division and how, you know, there's a lack of, let's focus on racism, not the people. We have to understand how we could do that, because maybe
Yes.
the people who are shying away from the topic about racism is because they don't know how to do it. It's scary. It's something huge, right? And I don't know that answer. Feel free to share your ideas if you know why people are doing that. But I can imagine it's rooted in fear and doubt.
Yeah, and it really is hard to know what to do. I mean, there's this whole part of just learning about racism and about ourselves and sort of uncovering it and learning to think differently. But then there's what do you actually do once you know about it or you want to make a change? And that's really why we're having this conversation today is, well, what can we actually do beyond just recognizing that it's true, which is a really important action, but then where do we go from there? How do we actually make a difference?
Right. Thank you for, you know, transitioning there. And before we go into principles and action, I do want to be clear that race and racism is important to understand what it is first before we attack it. And so if we look at, you know, racism, right, it's definitely, it's two sides. It's oppressed and there's an advantage side, right? So it's a system of oppression, right? It's a system of advantage based on race.
Yes.
And so that's what we're tackling here. And the system is larger than we think, right? The system is housing system, our education system, our institutions, our voting, right? The system is how we look at our medical infrastructure. The system is how we look at, man, there's so much. I can go on for days, but long story short,
Yeah.
systems here. And to be honest with you, the United States was built on these systems. So bury our ancestors' decisions.
Yeah, and
you know,
there can sometimes be a lot of resistance when we're talking about systemic racism. And I think as Christians, we're really comfortable talking about our individual sin, but we're not very comfortable talking about our collective sin. And so, but it's really not that shocking. We know that we're sinful, we know that we're broken. And so we built these systems and we built our society as broken people. So it really shouldn't come as a shock that our systems are also broken just like we are individually.
Exactly. And so if we look at individual, you know, aspects of what we could do, we definitely can start where we are, because I love you mentioned, Tyler, everyone is a part of a system, right? So I am an educator, so that means I'm a part of the education system, right? If you are a realtor, you're part of the housing system, right? You have some connection to a system, many systems at that. And so let's begin there. Let's begin with what we could do, what we are already doing, and share those examples with folks who are on the call and folks who will see this video after.
Yeah, I think especially for those of us who are pretty new to learning about racism or even just about our own race. I know for a lot of white people, we're not used to thinking of having our own race or ethnicity or culture. It's like those other people have a culture and I'm just sort of the neutral one, but that's just not the case.
Yep.
So I think for those of us at the beginning, learning is really important. And so that could mean reading a book or watching a movie or listening to a podcast, but I think that also means listening. So one of the big advantages of the movement we have right now in 2020 is social media. We can follow accounts from people who are different than us and look different than us and hear from them, hear their stories. And so I definitely encourage people in the learning phases, not just to read a book, even though I think that's maybe one of the best things we can do to learn, but also to listen to our friends that are around us, but also to other people who are online and really develop a posture of humility, recognizing, okay, there's a lot that I don't know. So in the meantime, I want to be humble, I want to listen, and I want to trust what people are saying right now to me, even if I don't fully understand what that means or what that looks like.
Right. Trusting the process is huge in this, right? Because we do not know what we don't know, but we also don't know if we haven't experienced something, right? Community. These comments here. And so I want to add to a little bit of learning part. As you're learning and you're going through this understanding of racism and just understanding what's happening on the individual level, I want you to ask yourself why. And I think that's so important because I've seen so many educators, you know, consultants and folks who are watching a Zoom session or people who are on social media, and they think to themselves like, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm tired. I'm done. And it's that real, right? And it's a privilege to do that if you don't have to experience it.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
asking yourself why really helps ground you in that. So why do I want to learn this? How is this going to, improve the community, my city, my nation, my small group, whatever the case. And in asking yourself why, that will also lead you to the next step, right? In my opinion, as you're going through your learning process and your why, you already have a wealth of knowledge and you're like, okay, I know why I want to do this. Okay, I'm learning all these things. Now, like, who am I connected to? Right? So to your point, Tyler, social media, if you're following any Instagram channels, but where do you work? Right? Like, what church do you go to? What small group are you in? Do you have friends who are, different than you? Number one. That's huge. Let me pause there. I'm sorry.
Totally.
I felt
Totally.
that because there's a lot of people who are not extended to those relationships. And so it's easy to kind of, not have the understanding of what people are thinking or what should be done. When I have to respond to a post or what should be done right now. Is it just donating? Is it just having conversations on Instagram Live? Or is it just me researching and teaching my kids how to be anti-racist? It's about relationship in addition to learning and asking yourself why. So
Totally. Totally. So important. And diversity isn't the goal. It's not that once our church or our friend group looks like diverse enough, that means we can, check off our racism box. But that often with those things can be indicators of what kind of spaces we're entering into. And we can have we could be married to a person of color or have many friends or coworkers who are Black or whichever race. And that doesn't excuse us from being racist
yep.
or doing racist things. And so we actually need to be talking and listening about these things with them and on our own too, especially as you think about learning and in community, recognize too that Google is probably the best tool that you have for that. It can be really tiring and burdensome to ask your Black friend every single time you have a question about race.
Yes.
So Google it first. Chances are someone's already written an article about it. Definitely talk to your friends, but give them space and allow them to recuperate, because a lot of times I can engage a conversation really intellectually, but for the person that I'm talking to, I'm digging up trauma and hurt in their life. And so they walk away feeling really drained, and I walk away really grateful that I learned something new about someone who's different than me. Which also reminds me too that as we enter into learning, it's important to go beyond just engaging with racism intellectually, but also we need to do that emotionally. So as we're starting to learn, especially, our main emotions are probably going to be
Yep.
anger, guilt, shame, defensiveness, but we want to turn our feelings of guilt and defensiveness into grief. And that's a much more biblical response. The scriptures are filled with lament and sadness, mourning with those who mourn. That is a much more productive response. Guilt can often put walls up between us and other people, but when we start to grieve when we hear about something rather than just feel guilty, the point of talking about racism isn't that white people would feel guilty, but hopefully we'll come away from learning something new feeling grieved that this is the reality, that this is the history that's happened, that these things are still happening today. And when we start to grieve and lament and cry out to God, that's a much more appropriate spiritual response than simply just feeling bad about ourselves. That doesn't end up helping anyone.
Absolutely. Check to all of that you just said. And check meaning yes, yes.
Yeah.
I comment that Meg just said, looking for resources yourselves so people of color and friends don't feel the energy. That is so true in all the aspects. And check to everything that you said, Tyler. I feel that the grief aspect really hits home because that's the part where we're human, right? And human in the best way, not the, the crazy, sinful way. But that's where we're able to connect with folks when we are allowing ourselves to feel the grief of what is happening, what has happened, and what needs to happen. And to be honest with you, we need to sit with that. It's like anything,
Mm-hmm.
relating it to
Mm-hmm.
relationships. If you are not openly acknowledging the feelings of your friends and family or significant other, it is hard for you to really move forward. It's hard for you to understand, and it's hard for you to be accountable. It's hard for you to change the behavior to be better. And so thank you for saying that. So in addition to, like, you know, physically and emotionally, I think spiritually, as you were talking, one principle I think we could do as Christians is to pray, right? Some scriptures that I'm looking at is Psalms 23, Psalms 91, and Psalms 27. And it's really about warfare, because I do believe that we're in a spiritual warfare. And I also think, like, in our small groups and also at church or friends, we can ask the leaders, like, hey, what are we doing about this? Can we have a conversation about race, right? I looked
Yes.
up some things on my own, right? I have some resources. Can we look at these together? Can we just talk about it every Wednesday, right? Talking to the leaders, I think, really makes an impact, because when the leader is having those conversations, it really does, you know, incite just people understanding, like, man, this is really a thing, because the leader is taking priority. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many, I'm going to say it, and I know I've been saying all the things, but there's so many pastors right now who are not saying anything,
Yes.
anything at all. And it's so heartbreaking, and it's so crazy to see that. And as leaders, it's important that the congregation, it's important that small groups, that people know, like, this is something that the Christian community cares about, right?
Yes.
Not divided. We're in solidarity. We are united, not uniformity, but we are united in our differences, and we look for inclusive change. And
Absolutely.
that is what we need. And
yeah, one
but go ahead.
one sermon about racism back in the spring is not enough. It's not enough. We have to recognize how much racism and white supremacy is not just something that's happening out there, but that it's happening in our churches. And we have to have conversations about that. We have to recognize that the way that our values as Americans and white supremacy values have changed the way that we live our lives as Christians. They changed the way we read and interpret scripture. And that's a hard conversation, but we need to have it. We need to recognize how whiteness and white supremacy influences who's in our churches, who's showing up, the things that stick out to us, that feel important. And like I said, the way we're interpreting the Bible. And so that conversation is way bigger than just one Sunday where we say, you know, racism is bad, without really taking any claim at how we're at fault, or talking about God's heart for justice. Or there's so much that needs to be unpacked there that we need to talk about on the top level, you know, pastors speaking on Sunday morning, and then in the group level, we need to talk about it in our small groups and with our church communities. And you mentioned how important it is to look at the systems we're a part of. And so as Christians specifically, our church, that is a system, and it's broken just like we are. And so that is a system that we need to address, and we need to tell our pastors that this is important to us, and that we need to really dig into it in our churches, because it's a valuable conversation.
So Tyler, you said that, and I think that there are some people on the I'm going to say call, but on the live, that might think, why is it important to us, right? So I want to answer that question, and then I want to answer the question that Meg shared. And Meg, I have an attachment to my answer to your question, so I'll come back to that. So why is it important to have these conversations? Like, what are your thoughts, Tyler?
Justice and equity are core principles of the gospel, and God has a huge heart for it. All throughout scripture, we read about loving our neighbor, the oppressed, the widow, the poor, the immigrant, our neighbor who's different than us. Like, these are things we read all throughout scripture. And for some reason, when I grew up, those things, I just sort of skipped over them and focused on, like, kind of personal salvation as the core principle of the Bible is I just have to pray to receive Jesus, and that's kind of what it means to live as a Christian. But these principles aren't just out there. Social justice isn't outside the gospel, it's part of it. God cares about each person individually, and we're all made in the image of God. And so when we fall short of that standard of every person being treated as made in the image of God, that falls short of what God has for us. And so it really should be important to us when we see our neighbors and our communities of color who are being treated differently or poorly, or however you want to phrase that, that's important to us as believers.
Absolutely. I think of it as like a picture, right? The picture is not completely, complete because we're missing some aspects. We're missing the abundance of unity. And I think God, this is a bold statement, but I do think that there's grievance in division, right? That's not part
Hmm.
of what God wants for us as a kingdom. And I think that when we are divided, it does hinder us from receiving some things and doing things together as Christians, as a body of Christ. So I think that social justice, when we think about how we do social justice, there are a lot of opinions. There are so many opinions. Like, we should march, we should shoot, we should yell, right? But as Christians, we should be the anchor to say, hey, here's how we do it. And that's something that I hope that people are getting out of this conversation that we're having is, of course, in your learning, asking why, but also understanding, you know you have to hold yourself accountable to these things, whether you're Black, you're white, you're a person of color. And it's important that you understand the ask that the Bible is talking about when it talks about justice, because it is something that is required of us as Christians, in unison. And I think that aspect of being different is okay. Difference is okay. And I keep saying that
Yes.
because when someone used to call me Black as a little girl, they used to be like, I'm sorry, I'm calling you Black. Why are you sorry because you call me Black? I'm Black. Call me Black. I love being Black. You know what I'm saying? Who told you to
Totally.
be Black, right? There's a problem. And so I think that's okay to have those conversations. And I kind of went on a ramble a little bit, but I wanted to say that because I just felt that was really important. And I
Hmm.
want to go back to Meg's question, who asked the question, can you share the definition of white supremacy? Ooh. So I'm going to do two things. So the first thing, I got a lot of likes. Dang. Okay. So first of all, I'm gonna hold everyone here accountable because I love y'all in Christ. Look it up on Google, right? And I'm also gonna give you the answer. Because that's what we're saying, if we're in this together, we're doing the work, we have to come in with something to the table. We can't just come in asking people all the questions. So with that, so when I think about white supremacy, I think about the definition of racism, right? And I think that this is a bold statement, risk chip, people who are experiencing racism have a greater understanding of what it is. Why? Because we're experiencing it, right? The definition of racism right now is not prejudice plus power, but the definition of racism from the experience is prejudice plus power. Someone who has prejudice against my group of people, right? Who I am, what I represent, my culture, my beliefs, and they have power to enforce laws and policies that will oppress me or my group of people, right? And so the definition of racism is prejudice plus power in a nutshell. If you think about white supremacy, right? White supremacy has existed since the beginning of this country. I think about 1619, white supremacy is a legacy. It's a legacy, essentially. This is my tailored short explanation as an educator. I don't want to lose you. Is that it's a legacy of prejudice with power. And I'll say that again. White supremacy is a legacy of prejudice plus power. So I'll give you an example. If you take a look at a lot of the leaders in our tech field industry, so our Googles, our Salesforce, right, our Hulus, or things like that, most of the leaders are at the table who are CIOs, CEOs. A lot of them are men and they're white men, right? If you're looking at the leadership in the universities, similar. If you Google historical Black college, you'll find all these HBCUs. You cannot Google historical white college. That will not Google it. I dare you. You won't find a historical white college. Why? Because they already exist. That's the legacy.
Hmm.
It's normal.
Hmm.
And so people are asking the
Yeah.
question, what is white supremacy? Because it's so normal.
Yeah, normalcy is a good point of it too, because a lot of times when we're talking about power, it's hard to understand what that means. Like, well, what power do I have? I'm poor or whatever, however that looks like. But even that sense of normalcy that so many of us who are white can say, I just don't have a culture, or I don't really have a race. I'm just white, and that we just assume that we are the kind of baseline and the normal, and that other people are different. And so
Mm-hmm.
even if you're not thinking about it in a directly like I'm better than you kind of way, just the fact that whiteness is the normal and the expectation uh, shows us that there's some differences between things. And so when a black person steps into a primarily white space, they're the one who's different, and they're the one who's going to be treated differently, whether or not the white people might realize that they're doing that or not. And so white supremacy is really complicated, and it can feel really triggering to hear those words because we've so heavily associated with things like the KKK, where it's, white people are the best and anyone else is lesser, or Nazis. But there's a lot more subtle ways that this still plays out today without looking like genocide.
Right. Thanks for saying that, sharing that perspective with me. I appreciate it. And I think I love that you mentioned the power piece to people who are poor and white. I want to talk about that a little bit, and then I want to go into the principles and then see if anyone has questions, any more questions. So I've heard this before where someone said, I don't have privilege because I'm poor, right? And I'm white. And I get that, right? And I think that one thing that I would love to share, especially as Christians, when we are thinking about grieving with our fellow kingdom Christians, if you will, we have to step outside of the situation and think about what privilege are they talking about, right? Because if you are, poor, there's obviously no privilege there, right? However, right? If you go to, I'm just making up something. If you go to a university and you say that your car broke down and you are with a white t-shirt, I'm going in, right? A tank top, and you're like, hey, I need some help, right? You'll probably get some help just because, right? Because you're white. And I think if you put the same person who is a person of color in the situation, there's going to be a lot of questions. Well, what's going on? What'd you do? But why are you with the tank top on with the white shirt? Like, there's so many things, and that's a subtle thing. But I think there's subtle privileges. It's almost like a conveyor belt. Like, it just happens, and it just feels so normal. Like, it just feels like it's okay for people to to not question certain things. It's okay for me to receive great interest loans when I go to purchase a house. It's normal for me to have X, Y, and Z. But the structures and the systems have made individuals in places that make them feel like this is normal for me to be poor. And I don't see my privilege because it's so normal. And I think that's a testament to our society. And it sucks because it has been part of the division that I've seen in people because they don't see it, because it is something that is, hurting them. And so I wanted to allude to that a little bit because I think that answers some of the questions that people may have around white supremacy and even more of the guilt that I think we talked about early on. So we talked about, early on what folks can do in terms of learning, right, about racism, asking themselves why, going to their leaders, praying. I think there's some controversial things with Christians and racism. And I know there's a couple of things like that I'm thinking about that may trigger some folks, right? But I want to pause and I want to hear from you, Tyler, to talk more about, like, if we are saying as Christians, we are against racism, right? And we are doing these things that we're recommending as Christians in our small groups, talking to our leaders, we're praying, we are learning, right? We're looking at our workspaces and we're going to figure out what we could do there. What does that mean for us? Like, when I say that, I mean, like, what does that mean for you as a Christian, as an individual, like within yourself? Like, how are you disrupting internalized oppression, right? If you're a person of color, or how are you disrupting, if there is, white supremacy within you? It's not a one-time thing. It's a continuous thing. So I want
Yes.
to answer that because I feel like it's almost like, yep, I did that. I'm done. Like a checkbox, like you talked about.
Yeah, yeah, and anti-racist. This term is incredible because when we try to have this binary of racist and not racist, then and you try to label yourself with one identity or the other, it's really hard because the truth is we're all racist at some point. And so it's better to think about it as something we do, like being racist, rather than someone like who we are. I'm a racist. It's because I can be racist, but the thing about being an anti-racist is that sometimes we'll make mistakes, sometimes we'll be racist, we'll say something racist, we'll participate in something racist, but we're committed to change, we're committed to learning and to humility and to repentance. And so it gives us some grace to make mistakes and keep going. And so especially as we're having a conversation about how Christians can act and what we can do, we have to know it's okay to make mistakes.
Yes.
It will happen. I've made mistakes. I've filmed a video or put up a post where I said the wrong thing, or I had a conversation with a friend and something didn't come out quite right, and I had to apologize. I had to be humble, but I've been able to grow from that. And so ultimately we need to understand that we're not going to get everything right. And so while at the beginning it can be important to not try to rush into action, like oftentimes we're 3 minutes into learning about racism and we're like, okay, what can I do? I have to make this better. But really, we're just wanting a band-aid. We just want it to go away because it's too hard to deal with. It's too much. And so that's not the right time to ask, what can I do? Is if you're just hoping for a band-aid to just like pass a law and suddenly racism is gone. So in that stage, we really need to be learning and dismantling in ourselves and things like that. But then once we get to a point of, okay, I think I sort of understand what racism is, what white supremacy is. I'm learning a little bit about this in myself. I'm listening to communities of color and what they're saying to me. Then we can start really looking at, okay, what systems are we a part of and how can I make a difference here? Because especially with learning or maybe some of the big topic issues, the one that's constantly in the media is police brutality. This is really important. And we all need to be involved in making change in this area because people are dying. But chances are for an individual, the best ways that you can actually make an impact is thinking about yourself. What systems are you a part of? What things are you passionate about? And how can you make a difference? So this means in your city, vote locally. Talk to your local politicians in your city and your state and learn. Ask them questions about what they're doing to make things better. If you're a teacher or you work for a Christian organization or a church or whichever sort of system you're a part of, maybe you're a lawyer, then think, okay, what work could I do? How could I be anti-racist in this space? And because you know about it, I can't, it would take me a world of learning and my whole life would have to change if I were to try to make some serious change in some other system. But because I work for a Christian organization, I can really advocate in that space, a space that I know I have connections in, I have power and influence in. And so that can be a really helpful thing for us to do. And it feels less overwhelming than like, okay, I know that racism is here in America. What am I supposed to do about it? But when we start to think,
Right.
oh, I'm a part of these systems. I'm a lawyer. What does that mean? What kind of ways can I live out anti-racism in this space?
I love that. And that way we run with the plain vision of, I know what space I'm in, right? I love that. I really love that because I think there is a lot of conversations happening right now, great conversations, but it's a lot of information. And right now it's important that Christians know next steps. Not,
Mm-hmm.
to have unity, but also to know where they're going. And I think when you mentioned, we have racist tendencies in us. I do want to be clear, talking about people of color and Black people cannot be racist because we don't have powers to how can I say this? Not to infiltrate. We don't have power to practice laws that will oppress white people, right? Neither do, I'm speaking for myself, do we want to. And so I think we are prejudiced. We can be prejudiced, right? But we cannot be racist. And I think in those moments where we have prejudice, we can still uphold white supremacy, right? By allowing things to happen, and making things be okay when they're not. And so I did want to say that because I think it's important that folks understand that. And it's not to shame, but it is to inform so we know what we're working with, right? And when we are in these spaces, to Tyler's point, and we know that we understand some information, we understand why we're doing the work against racism, that we have people aside from us who are experiencing this, but have not benefited from the privileges that we have. I know that was a lot, but it's important that we talk about that too.
No, that's great. That's great. And I definitely use we as, speaking on behalf of white people, but thank you for correcting me on screen. We're seeing it live where I said the wrong thing and she corrected me, and I can say, yes, you're right. I spoke with white as the normal and the default when that wasn't exactly how I should have said that. So it's like, great. Thanks for doing that.
I think that you are such a great example of vulnerability. And I also think for everyone out there, right, it's okay to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. And I know that you mentioned that, Tyler, because it's so critical that we know that. So that way we are confident to move forward with this fight against racism. We ain't perfect out here, all right? And I'm going to say in these plain languages, because if we're waiting to be perfect, it's never going to happen. In plain words,
yes.
we can't be
totally.
We can't be
and yeah.
Can't be perfect. We can't, and we're not.
Yeah, there's these extremes of not wanting to act because we don't know what to do. And that's important of we don't want to act too early because we're trying to put on a band-aid to a thing, a wound that's way deeper than a band-aid. But then the other extreme can be, I just have to keep learning. I still don't know. And this was me. I read so many books without really much action at all because I was scared to make mistakes. And so we have to live with both tensions. We have to wait until we know enough to actually make change that really matters, and not cause maybe more harm than good. But then there's a point where we have to say, okay, now is where I really need to start actually doing something and not pushing off action because I need to be perfect. And I have to work hard at this too. I have a desire to just say everything right and do everything the right way. But that's just not how this process is going to work.
Yeah.
And I have ideologies that are deep, deep, deep in me. So we have to have this posture of constantly learning, willing to make mistakes, but being really committed to growth and to change.
I love that. I admire your vulnerability. It definitely speaks a lot to your leadership. So I just wanted to say that as an educator, I had to put in that plug. So we talked about examples, Tyler, of what people could do, right? I think it would be cool to share what we are doing, right, as Christians to, fight against racism. So do you want to start with you? Or do you want me to go first?
Go for it. You start.
Okay. So for me, so I am a Christian. I'm definitely on social media, right? I am running a Rising Up and also my personal page as a writer. And so part of that part is informing and to generate awareness so people can come together to connect groups and individuals fighting against racism, racial injustices specifically. The other piece to that is, as an educator, I work with a lot of young adults who are Black and brown young adults, white young adults, right? I take those opportunities to educate them about what's happening in the world, and not just allowing them to learn college material and just going out in the world and not understanding how to be a change agent in this system of injustice. So I do that as an educator. And the third piece is, as a writer, I help folks disrupt racism through history. And I just write about history, and I help people understand what happened and how people disrupted things like this Haitian Revolution that happened, and how they were able to fight that injustice, which was slavery, and have their own nation. And those are the 3 pillars, or 4 pillars, I think. Social media, education, writing, and also history for me.
Woo, you're doing the work. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, well, similarly with social media. So everyone who's listening, don't come away with this thinking that the way that you do justice work in 2020 is to start an Instagram or be sharing posts every day. Social media is one avenue for doing for doing, but it's not the only way. So don't think that, you have to do it the same way or anything like that. But I found as a graphic designer that social media is a really awesome platform for me to be doing things. And so I recognize as I started asking myself, okay, what can I actually do? I looked at who I am as a person. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? I thought, okay, well, I'm a graphic designer. I'm really passionate about learning. I like communicating. I'm in ministry. I really like communicating principles to people so that they can grow. And it was these combination of things that I said, okay, so for me, that looks like posting on Instagram, creating a video, using my abilities as a designer to create things to inspire and educate and challenge. So that's sort of the space that I'm in, where I'm trying to advocate and make some change. And so I hope that everyone would be able to think about kind of where they're at and come at it from that way. And then the other side of me is I'm part of a predominantly white Christian organization. And so there's a lot of ways that even just within my job, I can be advocating for cultural competency and changing the systems that we've had set up for a long time that benefit people like me. And so there's some sort of internal work that looks different. That's not like a public action, but that's me working inside of the systems that I'm a part of to make change.
Yes, I love that. I absolutely love that. Yes. You know, I'm just thinking about, leaders in the Christian community, Tyler, and I'm thinking about, how scary this time could be. you know, just
Yeah,
not saying the right thing. And, I hope that, this is a shameless plug, but people share this with folks who are, leaders in the Christian community, because it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make
mm-hmm.
mistakes and say, hey, we want to figure this thing out. We want to have this conversation. And it's okay for the Christian community to make a mistake. It's not okay.
Totally.
So I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah, and cancel culture is not it. That's not what we want.
Yeah.
Shaming people and canceling them because of something they posted 10 years ago. That's not the way that this is going to happen. But oftentimes that does happen because there's a lack of humility and apology. And so I think especially we have to say, yes, it's okay to make mistakes, but then respond to those mistakes well. Apologize. Don't defend, don't explain that you didn't mean to. I've talked about this in some previous posts of mine
Mm-hmm.
because it's hard. But when we admit that what we did was wrong and harmful and we try to correct it, that is how we prevent ourselves from being canceled. When we make a mistake and then just defend ourselves to the death, then what are people supposed to do besides just say, okay, I can't associate with you because you really harmed me with your actions or with your words. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that we're responding to our mistakes well, and that's how we can sort of prevent and change this cancel culture into something that allows people to actually grow.
Absolutely. And I think you are someone who, serves as a role model in that aspect, right? A lot of people are still struggling in that area. And so what would you say to someone who is having a hard time being defensive, right? And not white, black, or, person of color is having a hard time being defensive um, around what's happening right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah. Yeah. Defensiveness is hard. It's really hard. And I think humility is really the opposite of that. And I think that when we feel defensive, we need to think about it as a tool. When I feel myself feeling defensive or guilty, I know, okay, I need to take a step back. I need to ask why I'm feeling defensive, why I'm feeling guilty about this. Were they even talking about me? Were they not talking about me? And that's why I feel defensive. And think about that in a critical lens. Say, if I was really trying to be humble or come at this from their perspective, how might I feel? Let me read an article about this thing that I'm feeling defensive about and see what has to be said about it. But yeah, I mean, I think being humble really feels like the key to that, but it takes work. It's hard. And I still find myself feeling really defensive, but I think when we use it as a tool to really wanting, that means I need to ask questions and I need to learn about something that I don't understand or that I feel angry about. And that's a lot more productive than simply feeling defensive and stepping back or excusing it as they don't know what they're talking about, or they're the ones who are being divisive or ignorant or whatever.
Mm. I love that. Thank you for being honest. You're just 100 on this call. Yes. I keep calling it a call. This live, y'all. I apologize. So there is a question. I love this question. So how can parents help? Do you know any resources that can help me explain how to be an anti-racist to my kids? That's great. So I'll take this one and I'll pass it to you. So I think there are so many resources out there, but the ones I would recommend is Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi. I also recommend Heroes of Color. This is someone who I actually know who's kind of like a hero, to be honest, for the organization that I work for. And Heroes of Color is a series of books about heroes in the history of color, but also heroes, just kind of make-believe superheroes of color. So your kids can learn about other people who don't look like them, which is great. I also think working with your kids and kind of exposing them to, different, how can I say this? It's something that is hard right now because coronavirus, but different kids, like if they're not hanging out with different kids, maybe once they're starting to read the books, start talking to them about, their friendships, maybe sign up your kids for there's like Zoom sessions, or I think I can send the link on a Rising Up, but there's a Zoom session for kids, which is crazy. It's like a webinar that's like dancing, which is like random kids around the world, random kids in Colorado, random kids in Sacramento. It's crazy, but it's just kids coming together across the world to dance. And it's just all different kinds of kids. And so I can share that information with you. But I think starting with the reading with Anti-Racist Baby and also Heroes of Color would be a good thing. And being honest with your kids. Don't lie to your kids. Tell them like, hey, this is what's happening. Let them know when you are, worried about what you don't know. I think when we do that as parents, as people, I think it helps the kids learn that it's okay to make mistakes. Because if we're shoving all this information to them right now in 2020 as kids, it's hard enough as adults to go through 2020. But as children, they should know like, hey, it's okay to make a mistake right now, this is what we're doing, this is what we're learning, and this is a process that's going to be a lifestyle. And so that's
Yeah.
my advice.
Yeah, and Ibram X. Kendi also has a book that's for older kids that kind of goes through some history and anti-racism teaching. It called Stamped. So that's also a good one. Anti-Racist Baby is like for little kids, and then if they're a little bit older, Stamped might be a good one. And if you Google resources for parents, there's some great articles out there. So definitely just recommend that as a step. But I think that I don't have kids, so I'm just speaking from what I've learned, but talking to your kids can be really helpful, even when they're really young. I think that a lot of us have fears that having conversations around race and racism when they're really young, it's too early or we're going to put ideas in their head, but that's just not the case. There are studies about kids as young as 6 months old being able to recognize differences in people, and then even when they're 3 years old being able to associate value with skin color. And so it's really important that we talk to them, scale the conversation down. You're probably not going to be talking about white supremacy and defining it with your 4-year-old,
Right.
but you can talk to them about the way kids are treating other kids on the playground. And then as they get older, you can scale those conversations up. Be involved with what they're learning in their history classes, even what books they're reading. Are they reading books by authors of color that have characters of color in them? And even novels can be incredibly helpful tools for us to build empathy and learn about people who are different than us. So it doesn't just have to be about, learning about the history of racism or something like that, but even just hearing from authors of color and communing with friends of color, like you're saying.
I love that. Thank you. Is there anything that we're missing in terms of like what we talked about for, really wanting to bring it down to the individual level for our Christian folks, parents, small groups, leaders who want to do something, as Christians against racism, but they don't know where to start?
I mean, one thing we didn't totally mention is talking about it within our like immediate circles, whether that be a family circle or a friend circle, kind of depending on what that looks like for you. But I'm glad we ended up talking about with kids, because within a family unit is so important. But even for those of us who don't have a traditional family unit, talking about it with our friends or with our parents or siblings or whoever, that can also be really important and really productive.
Yeah. And I think in my opinion, speaking to your family and your friends about race and racism could be harder than
Totally.
speaking to people you don't know. So I do encourage everyone to do that, if you haven't, because it's kind of hard. I've done it. It's interesting. It's very interesting, eye opening, and I think if we want to start somewhere, and we are looking to the spaces that we are connected to, and specifically systems that we're connected to, we should also look at home, right? I think there's a quote where it talks
Yes.
about leadership, where if you can't lead your house, you can't lead a nation, right? So if you can't talk about racism with your family, how are you going out there and trying to change everyone else? That's not what it's about. It's about, starting with yourself, starting with where you are, but also what's happening with your friends and family.
That reminded me of something else. One way that we can be acting that's sort of different is there's been some campaigns this year for supporting Black-owned businesses, or maybe immigrant-owned businesses or something like that. This is a great way. Think about what places you're visiting, what places you're buying from, who owns those places or runs them, where you're supporting. These can be really impactful things.
To add some Christian flavor to that, I recently gave an offering, partly to not just my church, but also to certain organizations that
Yes.
I that were working towards, racist, racist, racial justice. That's where my head's at right now. Racist, no. And so you can give offering, right? And that's one
Yes.
of it. So I
Yeah.
think we gave a lot of examples. I think we were vulnerable. We had like in the moment examples of what we were talking about, which was kind of cool. Didn't plan it. And I'm just so grateful. I'm really grateful and thankful for you, Tyler. And I keep saying it, but I am, because I don't see this. I don't see these conversations happening, right? Folks like me and you having this conversation who are young, like we don't have to be having this conversation. We could be talking about, I don't know, freaking Katy Perry or Tyler Perry or something like that.
The Perrys.
We care, the Perrys. Yeah. So we care. And I think, I hope that people know that we're not saying we're experts, but we're here because we
Yes.
have a heart for this movement, and we have a heart for the people who identify as Christians, because we are supposed to be unified. We are supposed to be sharing messages of solidarity and not causing division. And also, the work doesn't stop. It's a lifestyle.
Yes.
Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And I'll pause if there's any questions we can answer. If not, Tyler, feel free to add something, and then we could wrap up.
No, that's great. Thank you. And really, thank you for having me, and thanks for the work that you're doing. I love that. Just the work doesn't stop, and remembering that doing something is important. And it's not about being an expert. It's not about quitting your job and being an anti-racist educator full time. That's not what we're saying. Complicity has historically been the main thing that's allowed racism to continue, is just the lack of anyone saying anything, even when a lot of people probably disagreed with some of the things that were happening in the 50s and 60s. But if they did, they didn't say or do anything about it. And so it was able to just carry on. And so in the same way today, if you're not quite happy with what's going on or you think it's wrong, we have to speak up, we have to act, we have to vote locally, and be willing to change. It's a lot of people doing a little bit of work that's going to be way more impactful than a few experts who are trying to lead the way and get
Yeah.
everyone on their side. So it's important for those of us, the little people who, have 1,000 followers on Instagram, but are
Yeah.
passionate about this, that we can make a difference in our own communities and be advocating and working towards change. That's really going to make a difference.
Absolutely. And if we work together in this, and we're not shaming our brothers and sisters, especially who are believers and working towards this movement, then we can send a message to, one person, two people, small groups, communities, that this is something that is normal. It's normal to have these conversations as Christians, to fight against injustice. It's normal to be different and be on the same page. It's normal.
Yes, yes.
I'll say it again. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. This is a solidarity message we're sharing. We need each other in this movement. If we divide, then we are not in a good space. Amen.
Amen.